People sometimes say their house feels alive. Most times they mean the creaks and the pipes. Tonight's 7 stories are different. 7 accounts where someone else was living inside the house. Not upstairs, not in the basement, but inside the walls. These are true-style submissions. Don't listen alone. I should have known the house was cheap for a reason. The listing called it cozy, my landlord called it quaint, and the 4 walls were all I could afford at the time. It was winter when I moved in, the kind of February cold that makes you keep the heater on until your nose goes numb. The smell hit me first. Not a bad smell exactly, more like a basement that hadn't been aired in months. I shrugged it off while moving boxes and swearing at furniture that wouldn't fit through the door. The landlord, an old man named Gerald, left me a flashlight and a warning to watch the pipes. I lived alone and liked it. The house had quirks. The radiator hissed like a sleeping dragon, a back door stuck in wet weather, and a crawlspace door under the stairs. I didn't go in there. Who does? It's a place you open only to verify you're not imagining things. A week in, I woke up to the sound of someone moving under the floor. Not creaking floorboards, not the normal settling sounds. It was deliberate soft shuffles, the kind your brain translates into footsteps when you're trying not to think about it. I sat straight up, listened, and the sound stopped like a tape that had been cut. In the morning, I found small piles of flattened insulation by the base of the access hatch. Insulation had been dragged into tidy little nests, like someone was making a bed out of the worst stuff in the world. I rationalized mice, raccoons, blah blah, but animals don't tuck in to sleep. I started checking the crawl space every couple of days. The hatch had been wedged a little open once, just enough to slide a flashlight through. Inside, the dirt floor had impressions in it. Thin human-like tracks, shoe prints smaller than mine, pressed with intention along the joists. And closer to the central support, a pile of old newspapers folded and smoothed, like someone had been using them to sit on. A cheap lighter lay beside them. That was the point when I stopped sleeping. I said nothing to Gerald at first. Why panic the landlord and sound paranoid? Instead, I moved the mattress into the living room and started sleeping with the TV on and the front light glued on. It's amazing what the human brain will do to keep from admitting fear. When I got brave enough to call a friend at 2 a.m., he stayed on the line with me while I listened to the house and pretended I wasn't sweating. One night, I heard a muffled voice below me. Not a shout, more like someone talking in their sleep or mouthing words. I dropped the lamp and the light splashed over the stairwell right onto the crawlspace hatch. The hatch had been pushed open maybe an inch. The light lit a pale strip of inside, and in that strip, I saw a shoe move away under the floorboard. The sound of breath came like a paper against fabric. I ran outside barefoot and banged on Gerald's door until he opened. He came in with a flashlight and a frown and followed me to the stairs. "We'll check it," he said, like a man who'd seen too much. We pried the hatch. The smell hit both of us. Inside were little more than piles of bottles, a threadbare sweater, and a bundle of hair ties. Scattered around were empty packets, food wrappers, a lighter, and a small notebook with scrawled short lines. Times and numbers, like a daily log. The thing that made my stomach drop was a photograph folded under a rock. My living room window with the curtains open, taken from a low angle. The time stamped on the notebook matched dates when I had been out of town. We called the police. The officer who came took a long look and asked if I'd noticed anything else missing. I hadn't. They dusted for prints and, after some time, came back and said the prints were partial and small but definitely human. No arrest was made. No one on the block had reported a missing person or anything suspicious. Gerald admitted he'd had squatters in the past, but never under the floor. They'd been evicted months ago. I moved out 2 weeks later. I took very little with me, only a few shirts, my wallet, and the photograph. The notebook is in my desk drawer now. Sometimes at night I go through it and see the neat times and the vague references. 11:40 home. Left lights. She sleeps. The handwriting is small and careful, like a person trying to be invisible. You lock your doors and check your windows. Maybe add checking under the floor to that list. People live in strange places, sometimes closer than you think. I lived in an old duplex with thin walls and a landlord who thought a coat of paint fixed everything. My roommate took the master bedroom and I had the smaller room with the tiny closet. The closet door squeaked if you shut it too fast, and there were always a few winter coats someone had left behind by a previous tenant. The weirdness started with small things. An extra hanger in my closet, a stray sock on the top shelf, a matchbook tucked in between shirts when I knew I'd never had one. I'm the kind of person who checks and double checks. My logic said, suspect odd behavior, and my heart said, don't be stupid. One morning I found a small gap between the wall and the back of the closet. Not a seam like the plaster had been thin in one spot. It was about the size of a fist and dark inside. I poked it with a ruler and felt a hollow space beyond. Soundproofing? Nope, just air. I did the responsible thing. I told my roommate. He laughed, but the laugh had no warmth. Old houses, man, he said. Still, he pushed the closet back a bit and the baseboard unscrewed with surprising ease. Behind it was the cavity inside the external wall, a hollow thin enough that an adult couldn't squeeze through, but a small person might tuck themselves into for a little while. In the corner, there was a scrap of tissue paper with a bit of mascara on it. I didn't wear mascara. That night, I woke to the sound of tiny scratching. It wasn't like nails on drywall, more like fabric moving or someone shifting a bag. I lay perfectly still and listened. The sound traveled along the wall, like someone shifting their weight in a cramped space. I hear things now. I heard that sound and it lodged in my bones. I took a flashlight and pushed the closet back. The hollow was deeper than I'd expected. Someone had pushed a newspaper through and folded it into a cushion. There was a faint, stale odor like someone had been living there cramped for days. Tucked under a board, I found a small, flattened packet of instant coffee and a stubby pencil. It was almost absurd, like seeing the evidence of simple human needs. The next morning, my roommate swore he'd heard nothing. He thought I was making a fuss until he found the tissue with mascara. He went pale. We called the landlord. He came over, tools in hand, and dismantled the closet from the inside out. There were marks on the wood, gouges from something sharp. Under a false panel, we found a thin blanket folded around a cup made from a paper bowl. On top of the blanket sat a small, hand-drawn calendar with dates circled and a name written in pencil. The police came and poked around. No one came forward to claim the items. There were finger smudges on the inside of the cavity, faint enough to be missed unless you were looking for them. The landlord swore he'd never known to have a person tucked there, and he seemed genuinely rattled. He gave us a refund and said fix-up would begin the next week. My roommate and I shared a bag and split town the next month. I still check closets in new places. You learn to watch for things that don't belong. An extra hanger, a faint smell, the way a wall sounds when someone breathes behind it. Some people are quiet because they have to be. When my sister moved to the city, she told me about the tiny attic apartment above her building's roof. It's basically a walk-in closet, but cheaper, she said. The landlord called it a bonus unit. It had one window and a slanted ceiling and a streetlight that hummed right outside the only window. She lived alone and liked the smallness of it. It was a good rent for a student and she promised to keep the place tidy. She was also careful, always locking the stairwell door and letting no one use her key. One November night, she called me crying. Not crying like someone who'd stubbed their toe. Crying like someone who'd seen something she couldn't take back. She told me she'd woken up at 3 a.m. to the sound of whispering. It wasn't outside. It was inside. The whispering seemed to come from the cavity between the attic floor and the roof, like someone tucked inside the insulation and talking to themselves. The building's roof had an access hatch inside the apartment, small and screw-locked. She swore it had always been secure. This time when she went to check, the hatch was open just wide enough for a hand, and the smell that slipped out was that stale, oily air you get when something has been living somewhere for a while. She called the landlord. He shuffled over in his slippers and said he'd take a look. The three of us, my sister, me, and the landlord, pried up the hatch and shone a light into the crawlspace. In the dimness we saw a nest of towels, a bent spoon, and a pair of small sneakers tucked side by side. Smeared on a crate was a child's doodle. There were scratch marks along the joists and a tiny, folded note that said only, "Staying." My sister nearly fainted. The landlord got a policeman on the line, and they put out a civil notice. They found nothing that day. They checked the surrounding blocks for missing persons and posted ads in the storefronts. No one answered. For a while, they kept a camera pointed into the attic space. At first, the camera showed only darkness and settling pipes. Then, on the third night, it captured slow-moving shapes along the beams and the sound of soft humming. On the fourth night, the camera captured a hand-small, pale pressing against the tiny opening of the hatch. The footage was pixelated but unmistakable. A small face pressed to the wood for a second and then gone. My sister moved out 2 months later. She kept the footage. She played it once at my birthday and paused it on that pale oval. We watched the stillness in that frame for a long time. I can still see the tiny face in the corner of my mind if I close my eyes too hard. Sometimes I imagine a kid finding a warm spot in the rafters in the cold. Sometimes I imagine something else. I prefer the kid version. Walls are full of space, but not always emptiness. I lived in a small row house that shared HVAC vents with the adjacent unit. We'd been there only a month when I started noticing my bathroom pillows were shifting slightly, like someone had been leaning on the vent cover. At first, I thought it was rodents. Then I heard a voice. It happened when I was in the shower steam and the sound of warm water. Through the tiles, I thought I heard a muffled laugh, a breath, like someone in the next room. The house was supposedly empty next door. The owner rented it, but no one had moved in yet. I shrugged it off until a few nights later when I found a damp towel folded into a neat square inside the bathroom vent. We had vents that pulled from the kitchen and the bathroom into a shared ductwork. Someone had pushed the towel into the vent from their side, impossible to do unless you could reach behind the grill. I unscrewed the vent and shone a flashlight into the black shaft. The light reflected off a bit of foil and a strip of clear tape. There were faint scratch marks around the inner lip of the vent, like a hand had slipped through and tried to steady itself. I called the landlord and explained. He told me to leave it to him. A week later, he came over with a contractor and said there was no house next door. The owner kept the place vacant because of taxes. He shrugged and said, "Old vents get weird deposits." I wasn't convinced. 2 nights later, I came home and found my bedroom door locked. I hadn't locked it. I opened it with a pen and found a piece of folded paper under the bed. On it were 2 words. "We saw." The handwriting was small and careful. My breath hitched. I called the police. The detective who came was a soft-spoken man who took one look at the note and the towel in the vent and recommended we board the vents and set up a camera. They did a search of the crawl space and the shared ductwork. Maintenance pried up a loose panel and found a space above the vent, a narrow pocket used as an access route during construction. Inside were the remnants of domestic life. A book, 2 spoons, a pair of glasses with a bent frame, and a small stash of coins. The thing that made my skin prickle was a little note in the pocket that said, "We listen." The letters were pressed so deep the imprint showed on the backside. A few weeks later, a security guard found an open vent near the roofline where, if you leaned over just right, you could see the edge of a thin mattress tucked into an attic corner. No one was there when they checked. The police canvassed the neighborhood and installed a lock on the vent access. I moved out that summer. I still check vents when I stay anywhere. I learned that if you share air, you share secrets and sometimes people. Some tenants don't have keys. The house had been in my wife's family for generations. Old plaster, ornate molding, and papered walls that had seen more summers than any of us could count. We moved in after her mother passed away and began the slow, loving work of cleaning and repainting. One afternoon, while stripping wallpaper in the upstairs hall, I found a seam that didn't line up. The paper peeled back and there, under glue and decades, was a small screw. I pried off the near corner and found a thin metal plate like a tiny door. Behind it was the hollow space inside the wall, and behind that, a narrow doorway cut into the studs small enough that only a thin person could navigate, but definitely a space someone could crawl through. My wife was downstairs making tea when I called out. Her footsteps in the house sounded normal, domestic. We both went up and peered in through the gap. There were old magazines, a tin of mints, and strangest of all, an old Polaroid on top. A low-angle photo of our living room taken from outside the window. The curtains were open in the photo. The picture was dated 10 years earlier. We ripped the wall open properly. Behind the plaster was a narrow cavity that ran the length of the hall, with a patched square where someone had once cut a tunnel into a back room. Inside were tiny handprints, childish and darkened with age. Folded neatly on a rag mat was a small scarf and a broken pencil. A name was penciled on the inside stud. Nora. No last name. We called a contractor who told us the cavity had been part of old chimney work and had been repurposed over the years. He also told us that during wartime and hard years, some people in older houses used to hide there in secrecy. That made sense until we found, tucked behind a loose board, a fresh razor-sharp shaving blade and a receipt stamped 3 weeks ago. We put a camera and left it running for 3 nights. The footage recorded nothing until the second night at 2:11 a.m., when the camera pinged motion. We watched the clip and saw a shadow slide along the open space and a faint silhouette push itself into the narrow doorway. At the 10-second mark, a hand reached out and touched the camera lens, smearing it. The clip is grainy, but the smear was clear. We called the police. They did a thorough search but found no one. When they asked neighbors, an old man 2 doors down said he remembered a woman sleeping in the house years ago, never seen in daylight, always at night, and that sometimes he'd hear soft humming behind the walls. He'd assumed she was a relative hiding from something. We boarded up the cavity and installed motion sensors in the crawl space. For a while the house felt safer, but on the first rainy night after we sealed it, our daughter woke up and said she'd seen a woman at the end of her bed, pale, smiling, then vanish. She was 4 and a child's imagination is wild, but we'd both seen the smear on the lens. We moved the Polaroid into a box and put it in the attic. We left a note stuck into the narrow space that read, "You are not our guest. I still check wallpaper seams. I still pull off corners when I'm alone." Old houses have a memory, and sometimes that memory sleeps halfway through plaster. Walls can be cover. They can also be a hiding place. I worked the night shift at a hospital for a while. The building was older wiring from a different century and an HVAC unit that sounded like it was digesting the moon. I liked the job. Quiet corridors, fluorescent lights that hummed, and the privacy of midnight charts. One week, the janitorial staff complained about missing supplies. Boxes of gloves and sanitizer went from locked closets. The maintenance guy, Tom, said he'd look into it. He had keys to most service cupboards and a calm way that made people relax. He'd been there for years. A few nights later, I was taking a cigarette break in the loading bay when I heard low voices coming from the ceiling tiles. At first, I thought I imagined it. Hospitals have sounds. But this time the voices were deliberate, whispering, and one of them said a name, my name clear as if someone had been practicing the way I said it. I got back inside and followed the sound like someone following a scent. The voice led me to the supply closet near the maintenance wing. I leaned my ear against the wall panel and heard fabric moving, the soft rasp of breathing in a tight space. I could hear coins being counted. I could hear someone humming an old lullaby. The maintenance crew pried up ceiling tiles and found a small crawl space above the supply closet. It was insulated and warm, a perfect hiding spot if you wanted to be invisible. In the rafters, tucked behind ductwork, they found a blanket, a small radio, and a stash of the missing gloves. There were jump cables and a roll of duct tape. The thing that froze me was a small, hand-scrawled list of names and time staff names, one of which was mine. Tom swore he'd never go into that space. He said the access panel was padlocked. The key was missing. The detective took statements and said people sometimes hide in places where they can watch without being watched. They dusted the blanket for prints. Some partials matched Tom's key ring prints, but the lab was slow and, in the end, there was no arrest. I stopped taking cigarettes in the loading bay. I started leaving at the end of my shift with a group instead of alone. The hospital never announced a security breach publicly. But when I walk the supply corridors now, I pull the ceiling tile aside and look up. You can always find a place above your ceiling if you're determined enough. Sometimes the person watching has a job badge. This is the last one I'll tell you tonight, and it's short because it's the simplest and the most stupidly terrifying. I was staying at my aunt's house for a weekend when I was 20. She'd always been eccentric, keeps jars of pickles in the hall. talks to her plants, but she locks her bedroom at night and is very careful about visitors. One early morning, I woke up thirsty and put my foot on the floor. It was freezing. I padded to the kitchen and flicked on the light, and something about the hallway felt wrong. I felt it in the way the wallpaper pulsed under the light. There was a faint sound, like breathing, coming from the living room. I went in and saw at the base of the wall near the floor what looked like a shadow in the outline of an electrical socket. The cover plate was slightly loose. I knelt and looked closer, and for a heartbeat I thought it was a trick of light. Then, slowly, something moved in the socket. Not a hand, but a shape curling there, like a cat tangled in a plug. It moved with logic, like something compacting itself into an impossible place. I took a butter knife and wedged the screw. The plate came off in my hand, and a smell like old cloth came up, stale, warm. Inside the void, I found a small, folded sweater and a scrap of paper. The paper had one sentence: "I live where no one thinks to look." That's it. I told my aunt the next morning, and she made tea but didn't ask many questions. She replaced the plate and said, "It's probably just a kid playing games, dear." She's the kind of woman who looks at the world and chooses the gentlest answer. That afternoon, I found a tiny ball of wool on the mantel, the same yarn as the sweater. I took it with me and put it in my pocket. When I told friends later, they laughed and called me dramatic. But that night, lying in a hotel bed, I thought about the tiny things: thread, a scrap of paper, and how they're the quietest evidence of someone trying to be small. I never stayed in that house alone again. Those were 7 stories of people who found others living inside their walls. If you've ever found something you couldn't explain in your home, a mark, a print, a tiny nest, email your story to scaredalessenmond@gmail.com. Keep it neat and true style, we might read it. If you like this, subscribe for more true nightmare stories. Good night.